Well, after 14 years of Tory rule, Labour has won a landslide. It came despite the Daily Tea pouring Rishi Sunak a cuppa from our famous big yellow teapot and discussing all manner of issues, including which Star Wars film was his favourite.
And we have interviewed all sorts on the Daily Tea, from Wes Streeting when he was Shadow Health Secretary. Of course, now he is the Health Secretary. The former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. A couple of Tory grey hairs, Ian Duncan Smith and David Davis.
I asked Michael Gove at the Silverstone launch of the Conservative Party manifesto whether Rishi Sunak was hitting the skids, while Kamal asked Darren Jones, now the new Chief Secretary to the Treasury, just how many billions Labour was planning to spend on its Green Prosperity Plan.
So in the spirit of the Daily Tea, which is all about discussing the headlines in an insightful and entertaining way, we thought it'd be a great idea to reflect on a Britain on the brink of what could be really significant change and ask, what does it mean for you and for the UK? But also, what should the Tories be doing? And how will things really transform? Will they transform over the next 5 years before we're all back again to have another general election?
Not another one. In this special Daily Tea live event, we're going to be discussing how the Labour Party plans to fix broken Britain, what it means for the pound in your pocket, and for the future of conservatism in this country.
Now, to do that, not just Camilla and me, but two brilliant brains. Paul Lewis, to my far left, whether that's politically, we will find out over the next hour. He has been a freelance financial journalist and broadcaster since 1986, presented the wonderful Money Box on Radio 4 for almost 25 years. Unparalleled knowledge. Won a whole plethora of awards for his work explaining personal finance and campaigning for change, having spent his career defending the interests of consumers. Welcome, Paul, to the Daily Tea.
Thank you.
And alongside Paul, we have Gordon Rayner, also known as G-Ray, who has had the two most important jobs in the newsroom because he's been chief reporter and he's been political editor in his career at The Telegraph, I think spanning now 17 years. He was one of the journalistic masterminds behind the expenses scandal, jointly wrote a book about it with our deputy editor, Robert Winnett, and he has since been responsible for a series of scoops, including the Nigel Farage debanking scandal.
So we couldn't be in better company to discuss what the Labour government means to you. Welcome to this special Daily Tea live event with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey. And as explained, we're going to speak and ask our panellists all of the key questions, but we're also going to be opening the floor to you to ask any of us whatever you like. So, first of all, let's discuss the current state of the British economy, because the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, as everybody in here knows, has been very keen to stress what a terrible economic legacy she has inherited. She's even said, Kamal, hasn't she, I didn't quite know it would be as bad as this. So take us through the stats. Where are we at just generally with some of the key indicators of how Britain's doing?
Yes, let's go through. The economy is going to be one of those foundational issues. We should also say a huge hello to everyone who's watching this online. We're here at Telegraph HQ in the heart of London. One thing that Labour will want to do for a while, and we will get onto this with Gordon and Paul and you, Camilla, is they're going to want to remind people about the legacy. It's not our fault. Here are the things we need to do. But let's just go through a few of the numbers. The economic legacy is nowhere near as rosy, certainly, as 1997, but not actually as bad as a year ago, which again slightly raises the question of why Rishi Sunak went so quickly for the election, but we might get onto that a little later. So let's just go through those numbers. The UK economy grew by 0.4% in May. That was a rebound from 0% growth in April, and got the rather odd reaction from the Office for National Statistics, which are a pretty sober bunch of people. They described the economy as going gangbusters. I'm not sure that 0.4% growth is gangbusters, but anyway, it's certainly more positive than it has been. Latest inflation figures have inflation at 2%, which is the Bank of England target. Will interest rates change in autumn or even before that in August because of that lower inflation rate? Interest rate is currently at 5.25%, still actually pretty high in comparison with where interest rates have been since the financial crisis. Now, any of the economists in the room, I was the economics editor for a number of years for the BBC, will know that we can talk about growth all we want, but productivity, the amount of output per hour per worker, is what really leads to wealth. And there, boy, do we have a problem. Just before I came to join us up here, I just looked through our productivity history if you go back to the Second World War. The 3 decades after the Second World War, productivity in the UK averaged 3.6%. After the oil crisis and through the 80s and 90s, productivity dipped to 2.1%. So 3.6% in the decades after the Second World War, 2.1%, 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s. Financial crisis. Since then, the average productivity rate in the UK, how we create wealth for all, 0.2%. Been pretty much flat ever since. That shows some of the really deep-seated issues we face, not just a Labour government, but any government. And then let's look at our public finances, debt to GDP. Back to 2000, debt to GDP, 36%. Now hovering around 100%. Financial crisis and COVID have cost us an awful lot of money. We haven't paid back any of that debt since the early years of the 2000s. So we're running a deficit in nearly every year of this century. And then just finally, the tax burden. How much is the state taking of the income we earn and the income that companies earn?
Too much.
The burden has been at the highest rate overall since 1950. Again, COVID particularly has led to a huge number of bills for the country, furlough, people being off work for extended periods, and all the things that need to be done around health, etc. has cost us an awful lot of money. Huge tax burden. But there is an odd little, it's not an anomaly, but a detail within that. If you're an average earner, on your personal income, you are actually paying the lowest amount of your tax in income since you've been paying since 1975. So what's actually happened is where that burden is falling is on the wealthier, particularly the 5% and above most wealthy people in the UK and business. So the tax take is huge. The wealthier have been most affected. But if you're on average incomes, actually your personal income tax rate is the lowest it has been since the 1970s. So that's a slightly odd anomaly. So a mixed picture, a little better than the Labour Party are admitting, but some deep-seated problems.
So let's get into tax. And first of all with Paul, because I know you were keen to talk about this. So I think from the election campaign, we certainly know who Labour aren't planning to tax more. Working people, whatever that means. So they ruled out any increase to national insurance, any increase to income tax, and any increase to VAT. Paul, but some of the cynics writing for The Telegraph and indeed reading it are suspicious that when the next budget is announced, there'll be stealth taxes, particularly individual taxes. So what's your suspicion as to how Rachel Reeves might raise more revenue?
Yes, I think she certainly will. And I mean, it's a bit, we've got a sort of Schrodinger's box with taxes at the moment. Until we open it, we won't know whether they're going to be alive or dead. She did make that promise, no increase in all the tax rates, income tax rates in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, I should say, because Scotland does its own. No increase in VAT, no increase in national insurance, and also no increase in corporation tax. That's the 4 big taxes. That's 80% of the tax income. So somehow she has to raise other money. How can she do it outside those promises? And one accountant I was talking to suggested that it would be taxes on wealth. Not a wealth tax as such, which is a very difficult thing, but things like inheritance tax. Now, in a sense, she doesn't have to do anything, because if she just leaves it, inheritance tax thresholds and rates have been frozen since 2009, just about. So if she just leaves it, she's going to be getting more inheritance tax every year anyway. But what she could do is look at some of the big exemptions from inheritance tax. For example, I mean, I exaggerate, but if you buy a field and then you leave it to your family and you live a couple of years, there's no inheritance tax to pay on the value of that field. It's slightly more complicated, but enough lawyers make money out of advising people to know it's happening. And similarly with business property, and that's mainly unquoted shares. Between the two of them, those reliefs are £4 billion a year. So those could be amended, they could be capped, they could go. But the big one is lifetime gifts. Now, you can give any amount to anyone in your life free of inheritance tax as long as you live 7 years. So lifetime gifts are effectively free. And even if you only live a couple of years or 3 years, you get a reduction in the tax. Now, that's an unlimited exemption. And of course, wealthy people use that. They've got free money. They're in their 50s. They think, well, I'm going to live another 20 or 30 years probably. So they start giving their money away. So you could put a cap on that. You probably won't scrap it because you don't want to affect working people who may well want to give a bit of money out of their ISAs. So you could do that, and that could bring in money. We don't know how much because no one's ever estimated it. I imagine there are people in the Treasury busy with their pens at the moment and their calculators. And also the other thing on wealth, dividends that you earn on shares, they are taxed at a lower rate than earned income when you go out and do a job. They could be raised at higher rates anyway to the same. That would bring in some money. And also capital gains tax, which, you know, Nigel Lawson, the great Tory reforming chancellor, said he saw no difference between capital gains and income and taxed them exactly the same. Since then, the tax on capital gains is a lot lower. It can be as low as 10% or 20% for higher rate taxpayers. That could be raised. So in all those ways, she could raise more money. She wouldn't be affecting, quotes, working people, at least most of them, though in a sense everybody works and earns their money. And she could raise a considerable amount of money. I don't imagine she'll do it bang, but you mentioned this statement to Parliament about the state of the economy. I think one purpose of that is just to say how absolutely dreadful it is. Not that I'm saying I think it is, but I think she will say that. I've got to do something. And then a couple of months later, it'll be the budget, middle end of September probably, and then she'll be saying, well, you know, I've got to do this and these people can afford it.
One group of working people that will be taxed more potentially is people who send their children to private schools, Paul. We have seen that sort of, there's the mood music to legislate for that. They've said they will introduce measures to strip private schools of their VAT status. We could frankly do a whole session on this, and let's not get into the weeds of it. What's your one piece of advice? What's your top piece of advice, Paul, beyond take your children out of private school, that you would give to fee-paying parents?
I would just say don't worry about it. Private schools have done well, even though they have raised the fees considerably over the last 10 years, hugely, and they're still doing very well. So an extra bit of tax on the fees won't make that much difference to most parents. That's not to say some won't do it. And I think all the surveys and the warnings are all part of a campaign. A, to stop Labour getting elected, and B, to make them change their minds. But I think really, if you've got children in a private school and you think it's worth it, then having to pay a bit extra, and don't forget, they don't have to go up 20%. The school can bear some of that cost, and certainly Labour government has said that, you know, we'll let them economise like state schools have to. And I think moving them to a state school with all the problems that will entail, both for the children and I suppose the state schools, if many do it, is just not worth it. But you just have to put up with it and either work a bit harder, or if it doesn't worry you, just swallow it, basically. That's my advice.
I think, Camilla, we've discussed this on the Daily Tea regularly. I think there is quite a lot of political risk for Rachel Reeves if she does do what might be considered to be rather sneaky tax rises by changing, as you suggest, Paul, some of the detailed areas on things. And I think, you know, organisations like the Telegraph and many others will be right on that. There's also, don't forget, with thresholds being frozen and Labour agreeing to the Conservative 3-year lock on thresholds, the same as inheritance tax, more people will be dragged into tax. So the tax rate for many people will go up naturally unless Rachel Reeves reverses that. I think, though, that given that Labour, you know, got into power with what's called a loveless majority, not with a huge load of enthusiasm from the country, I think if tax rises are pinned on Rachel Reeves in the first 6 months, that could be really, really damaging. Gordon, I just want to bring you in on this legacy issue that you said, Paul, and you, Camilla. How long do you think that Labour can keep rolling out what we've inherited is a major problem? Certainly, in a column I wrote at the beginning of this week, this idea of kitchen sinking, that bring out your dead, that Labour will constantly remind people on the economy, on the NHS, on prisons, on defence. Look what we were left. And I think there is actually some pretty strong evidence that the psychodrama of the Conservatives left many, many pieces of policy sort of languishing, unloved, uncompleted and unfunded. So there is some actual reason for doing it. But how long could the honeymoon last, or the momentum from blame the other lot sort of keep Labour kind of in a positive sense?
Well, I think they'll keep saying it for years and years and years. And in fairness, the Tories, we all remember the "there is no money left" note. That was 2010, and people still talk about that now, don't they? So I can't see Labour shutting up about it anytime soon. I think you'll probably hear Angela Rayner talking about the Tories crashing the economy until she dies, frankly. I think that's going to be a sort of forever thing for her. I think there are, obviously the straight answer would be to say, well, they've got a budget, they will have a budget coming up. They then start having to take responsibility for public finances. They have to start trying to put things right. But you can absolutely bet your bottom dollar that they will go on and on about the state the Tories have left the economy in, which is, like I say, exactly what the Tories have done. So I think the answer is for years. I thought there was a couple of interesting things in the wording of Keir Starmer's sort of preamble to the King's speech, because he called the King's speech a clear destination for our country, which, I don't know, was it very clear? Did you think it was very clear?
Heads being shaken.
No, for the online audience,
in the Telegraph
discontent.
Theatre.
Vague shaking of heads. And the other thing that I thought was really striking, or struck me, was that he effectively promised, and he used the phrase, higher economic growth in every community. That's quite a big promise.
Yeah.
And I think he's really sort of, created a rod for his own back there, because if I was a Tory MP, I would be quoting that back to him, on a permanent loop. You said higher economic growth in every community. Why have we not got it? And, it's not going to be very long before they start to press him on that, because like pretty much every incoming government ever, when they are pressed on where's all this money going to come from, they say growth, like it's some amazing thing the last lot never thought of, and so, we'll just get it all from growth. And their big plan for growth is planning reform, obviously, as we know. That is not going to happen overnight. So they're going to find, probably in a year or so's time, people are going to start getting a bit impatient and saying, where's all this growth? Where's this planning reform happening? And also, as we heard in a lot of interviews already with Labour MPs, they have themselves opposed planning reforms in their own constituencies. So it's not straightforward, and it sounds great, but the practicalities of it, I think, are going to be tricky, and it's not a sort of overnight panacea.
Also, you've got this situation with Rachel Reeves sort of placing herself in a straitjacket, Paul, because she's committed to following the Conservatives' fiscal rules when it comes to borrowing. She's saying she won't tax working people more, although you've outlined who she might tax. We've now got this extra power afforded to the Office for Budget Responsibility. Just comment on that, because the Tories' concern about the OBR is it used to be sort of an advisory body. Yeah, we're happy with the budget, we're not happy with the budget. And then it seems to have increased its power over the course of recent years to the point where it now seems to be setting the budget.
Well, I don't know if it sets it, but it certainly will tell the Chancellor of what it's going to say beforehand. And if it says, this is going to do one thing, the Chancellor can't say another. I mean, Chancellors used to make it up. They can't do that anymore since the Office of Budget Responsibility came in. I'm not sure it will set the budget. It will certainly set the framework for it. And I think that Rachel Reeves said she wanted to give it 10 weeks from when she took power on July the 6th, which before they have the budget, it takes about the 18th or the 25th of September. And I think I think she's also going to talk to them about how she expects them to approach it as well, because although it's independent, I think chancellors are influential on it when they have a word about how they should approach it, and she will be revealing policies to them, and they will be analysing it and say, well, if you do this, this will happen. If you don't do that, that will happen. And I think that it will be a dialogue, but I think the political people, the Chancellor and obviously the Prime Minister and ultimately the Cabinet will decide what goes in the budget. But they will have to have this scorecard from the OBR. And I think, they've used the example of Liz Truss. They actually used the word disastrous about Liz Truss in the notes on the King's
She's
Speech.
complained about it, by the way, to Simon Case, the Cabinet
I think they may
Secretary.
have taken it out now, but it's still in my copy, I must say. The disastrous mini budget. And they want to stop that happening again, but I think they may find that it also constrains them perhaps more than they'd like. And I think it will be a difficulty for them.
Gordon and Camilla, I think there's a maybe slightly more philosophical debate. Given that on your personal income at average earnings, you're actually paying tax as low as you were paying in 1973, do you think there might actually, if they could see improvements in the NHS, if they could see improvements in education, a little more stomach for taxes remaining at quite high levels? That we approach tax as a straight negative. People don't like paying more tax. Do you think that anything during COVID, anything during a period where we know, for example, social care, demands of the health services, etc., do any voters, maybe not particularly on the Telegraph side of the debate, might be willing to pay a little more? Gordon first, and then Camilla.
Look, I think one of the interesting things about the King's Speech was that there was nothing on social care. There was pretty much nothing on NHS reform. So they have to, before you can even have that conversation in the terms that you've just framed it, I think you have to say to people, if we're going to raise tax or we're even going to keep taxes high, this is what it's going to pay for. And they're not saying that at all. I was out talking to people in Nottinghamshire earlier today, and they were raising social care and saying, what are they going to do to fix social care? It's a massive problem for us. Why have they not said anything about it? So I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to the idea of, you've just got to swallow a high tax economy. If they're not even, they have to start saying, this is what the money's for, and these are the great ideas we've got, and here's how we're going to spend it, and it's going to work. At the moment, it just feels as though they're just shoveling money into a black hole because they can't be bothered to reform.
If you're going to commit to ever greater numbers being poured into the NHS, and you accept that we've got an ageing population, and as we discussed on the Daily Tea earlier this week, we've got a plunging birth rate, you're basically sort of seeing the state as the NHS with a number of other departments attached, and that's expensive. So people make the comparison between the UK and the US and say, oh, well, the average tax paid by anyone in the US is 33%. And you're like, yeah, but they don't have a health system to subsidise. But on the issue of paying more tax or paying less tax, we've had a lot of chat, particularly among lefties who can afford to pay more tax, the kind of lefties that can afford to pay Labour, but to vote Labour, saying, well, I don't mind paying a bit more tax. And you feel like saying, well, go to HMRC right now and pay more. Volunteer more of your earnings over if you're feeling that way inclined. I think what's interesting is quite often when people are surveyed and they're asked, would you mind paying an extra p in the pound for the NHS, which is often how Labour frames it, because then you feel like giving it to something. That's one thing. But I think increasingly, particularly in the post-COVID era, where people are waiting for operations and they can't get in to see their GP, and in some cases they appear to be taking out their own teeth with pliers, they're increasingly asking themselves, you're taking so much of my money for what? If public services are bad, if you're paying more tax for less efficient services, then that starts to feel like a really bad deal for the taxpayer.
All these reviews that are set up, very Gordon Brown approach, that you set up the review knowing the answer, it's not going very well, it needs more money, whether that's NHS, whether that's defence, whether that's social care. And if you go back to when Labour introduced the 1 penny on national insurance, which actually did appear to not be controversial with the public, obviously different economic era, I can see how they will use these endless reviews to try and change the debate on tax. As you say, Camilla, as you say, Gordon, they're unlikely to be successful. But Paul, can I bring you in maybe on that? But actually, we also want to talk about pensions and the pensions issue. Keir Starmer couldn't match Rishi Sunak's promise, obviously built on the fact that the taxes had only started under the Conservatives because of the way they changed tax rules on pensions, but said that state pensions will not be taxed under the Conservatives, i.e. the state pension would always be below the lowest threshold for paying tax, and Keir Starmer couldn't match that. Yeah. But do you see any hint that actually the fact that he couldn't match that has left open season on the taxing of pensionable income?
No, I mean, what he said was nonsense. 1.6 million people have a state pension higher than the tax threshold. So what Rishi Sunak said was actually untrue, because a lot of people, particularly ones with older pensions, not the new pension, but the old ones, they have a lot of extras, and that takes them above the tax threshold. And there's 1.6 million of them. I got an FOI on that just a few months ago. That was last year. This year, this tax year, it'll be even more. There is a danger, but it's a problem caused by freezing tax allowances, because if you're going to raise the state pension by earnings or prices or 2.5% every year, but you're freezing the tax allowance, then that pension is always going to head towards and above the tax allowance. And the state pension is taxable. So I'm sure people here know, if you've got a pension, you somehow pay tax on it because you pay more tax on your private pension or your earnings or whatever. So it is a taxable benefit. There will come a time, and it's a kind of a psychological moment more than anything else, when if you do raise the new state pension with inflation or earnings year by year, and you keep those frozen tax thresholds, which Rachel Reeves seems to be very likely to do. She said she'd like to raise them, but she couldn't afford it. That was before the election was actually called. Then you will come to that psychological moment. But it is only a psychological moment, because a lot of pensioners already pay tax. Most pensioners actually pay tax. And some of them will pay it just on their state pension alone. So there'll just be a few more of them. And I think Sunak's idea that he would raise tax allowances for pensioners along with the pension is a very divisive policy, because that implies you're going to freeze them for everyone else, and so all the people who are under state pension, age 66 now, 67 in a few years' time, they will say, well, what about us? We'd like our tax allowances unfrozen. But, Rachel Reeves is going to copy a lot of the Tory policies, and you'll remember that she was pulled up for copying big chunks of her book out of Wikipedia, wasn't she? She's now copied some of her policies from the
lawyer.
From the
all right with that? Yeah. We need to steal a march, because I'm realising time is getting away with us, and we want to include all of your questions. Let's just get on to Labour being the party of business, Gordon. When we get all of those emails through in reaction to the King's speech, oh, hello, I'm contact you on behalf of the Earthworm Society. This is what I think of the King's speech. I noticed a very muted response from the business community. Is this in response, do you think, to Angela Rayner's New Deal for Workers? What's being recommended by the Labour Party with this new employment rights bill will be an increase to the minimum wage, a ban on exploitative zero-hour contracts, ending the practice known as fire and rehire, and extending flexible working. I mean, we already know that Rayner is kind of the Prescott of the operation, right? But I mean, I'm not sure whether small and medium-sized businesses in this country are crying out for some of those measures, or indeed the regulation and the red tape that Labour want to reintroduce.
No. Well, I'm old enough, and so are you, I'm afraid, to remember the 70s, and
I remember a lot longer back than that.
Exactly. we had heavy unionisation in the 70s. It crippled a lot of businesses. It put some businesses out of business altogether. We had 3-day weeks. A lot of people here can probably remember having to have candles in the house the whole time because they literally turned the power off. And I think that maybe people who don't remember that think that having heavier unionisation, scrapping all these anti-strike laws that, like Angela Rayner wants to do, is great because it's going to empower workers. I kind of feel as though we're just sort of, history can repeat itself a little bit, and I think there's a danger that there's a sort of demonisation of employers, and I think Labour does this quite a lot. That if you are an employer, therefore you're bad. And you're exploitative and you're an awful person because, these people who are going and working, you take some of them. That's just how the private sector works. And, but I was in a cafe this morning and I was talking to the staff there. And the lady who ran it was, easily in her 60s, and she's been running it for a very long time. And she is really worried about what Labour are going to do about things like the 16-hour, maximum that people can work before their benefits start being cut. That she now is going to have to pay. She's worried about having to pay. National insurance on some of these extra. And the ladies working for her want to work longer hours, but they feel like they can't. And these are people on minimum wage. They want to go and work longer hours, and they're being stopped from doing that by red tape. And I just wonder if Labour, and quite frankly a lot of Tories, understand that, and that people want to go out and work. They want to earn money. They want to work for employers, and the employers want to employ them. And it kind of feels like they're getting in the way of that happening.
Yes, I mean, I think that the problem the government has is it wants growth, and it says that's business that's going to provide that growth. But it's going to put up the minimum wage. There's no doubt it's going to do that. It's an absolute promise. We don't quite know how far or how much, but certainly for 18 to 20-year-olds, it'll go up from £8.60 to at least £11.44 now, which it is at the moment, possibly £12 or so. So that's a big rise for 18-year-olds. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect, because if you're employing people sort of 18 to 25 and the older ones have been there a while, they can say, well, that 18-year-old's just arrived and I want to be paid more than her. Thank you very much. So I think there is a conflict between giving workers more rights, as they see it, or more money, and trying to get growth through business. And you mentioned the fact that if people work more than a certain number of hours, or if they earn more than a certain amount, they start losing their benefits or whatever, and that's why they don't do it. I think that was the point you were making. And, people on universal credit who earn an extra £1 face an effective tax rate of 74% by the time they've lost their benefit and paid their tax and national insurance. So that isn't an incentive to work. And I think you have to find a way to give people incentives to work. But of course, that would mean changing the universal credit rules, and of course that would be very expensive. But the good thing about raising minimum wages from a purely Treasury point of view is the more people earn, the less benefit they do get, because their benefits are cut. And of course the cost of that is borne by businesses. So it's win-win for the government. And I think that's why they really look to that as a way of solving some of their economic problems.
Unless the businesses can't afford to employ people on those wages.
Well,
then
yes, I mean,
you
always have to think of the behavioural impact of it, but they don't always do that.
I'd be interested, Gordon, in how many people in the government and as Labour MPs have actually worked in the private sector. You do find that there is a real ignorance about how businesses operate and the tiny margins that can make a difference. Fundamentally, I've run my own company for 3 years before I rejoined the Telegraph earlier this year. And when you've got your profit and loss account and you've got to make payroll every month, that is what you are focused on. And it is incredible, the difference between success and failure. And it only needs some additional data collection, because of course we're going to have the new Equality Act, which is going to mean that businesses are going to have to collect and publish more data. Not smaller businesses, but larger businesses are going to have to collect and publish more data. There'll be many more probable equal pay claims. Of course, there is nothing morally wrong with the idea that everyone should be paid fairly and treated fairly at work. And you can see what Labour's offer is trying to be, that a lot of these things like 0-hour contracts, like hire and fire, have been misused by business. So there is a duty here for business to step up. But as soon as Whitehall and government gets involved, you are reminded of the Ronald Reagan, quote, "The most dangerous words for a business to ever hear are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Because it's almost never true, because people in Whitehall don't operate where they have to make payroll, their incomes are guaranteed. I think this central area of business, which is private business, is 85% of our economy in wealth creation terms. If Rachel Reeves wants the growth that she wants, it's going to have to be a partnership. And I think there, with Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, we could see the first tension building.
Yeah, I don't see how the Angela Reeves's bill is in any way compatible.
Angela Rayner's.
Sorry?
You said Angela Reeves.
Did I
It's
say
like
Angela
a little
Reeves?
mashup of the
This is the new
Target.
Oh my God.
Like Brangelina.
It's like a hybrid.
It's a joint commission.
Good Lord.
I'm Caldwell now. I should be able to get that right.
Yeah, she's your great aunt, I
Yeah,
believe.
no. So yeah, I don't see how those two things are compatible. It feels as though they are pulling in completely opposite directions.
Let's move on. I just want to talk about the Tories and their response to this, because we're running out of time and I definitely want to get Q&A in. I was going to ask you about landlords also demonised by Labour, but we'll have to do that another day, Paul. I mean, it's a lonely place, isn't it, opposition? You're the Tories, you're in the depths of despair, you've got Reform and Nigel Farage nipping at your heels, trying to make the election all about immigration. Paul, is there a short answer to the question, which is immigration economically essential for Britain to grow? Because this is the counter-argument, isn't it, that we're not giving enough British jobs to British workers and that people are coming into this country and undercutting, and that's stifled growth, even though we know that we need immigration because of our falling birth rate to have more people in work than in retirement. Just square the circle for us as quickly as you can.
Well, certainly what I hear from businesses is that they have suffered badly from the fact that they can't bring, farmers can't bring fruit pickers in from Europe as easily as they could. Freedom of movement of labour has gone, and that has and people were very used to it. Now, yes, there may be another way of doing things, but I think we're in a very difficult transition period for a lot of businesses. And if they could bring people in, they would. And what Labour seems to be saying is we will make it easier. For care workers, for example, we make it easier for them to come in. And I think that's a sort of sensible, practical approach. And if you have a clear shortage of people able and willing to do jobs for the really, honestly, appalling money that care workers are given, considering the job they do. And I was talking to someone, they said, well, Tesco's just opened down the road and all my care workers went to work there because they get paid slightly more. And it's a lot easier job than looking after elderly and very dependent people. So I think you've got to find a way to let people come and work here. But the other problem with that, another one that Nigel Farage brings up is, well, where are you going to house them all? And I think we have this chronic housing shortage. And building 1.5 million homes won't necessarily solve it. They're building any number of flats near where I live in West London. No ordinary person, no working person can afford to rent them, or buy them. They're too expensive. You've got to build houses for the people who need them. And that doesn't seem to be in Labour's plan to me.
Gordon, let me I'll bring in first of our questions, actually. This is from Anne, who pre-submitted this question. I assume Anne is not, if she's not here, hopefully she is online and watching. But Anne says, and maybe Gordon, for you, what is the largest problem to be solved for the Tories to win in 2029?
Oh gosh. Well, they have to start agreeing with each other for a start. That's the first thing, I think. If they are still fighting each other, then forget it. So I think that's the first thing. Then they need to decide what they actually believe in, and then they all need to unite around that. And I think because we're talking about immigration, I think one of the things they need to do is to listen to what people in the country say about immigration and be prepared to say some of the things which a lot of politicians don't want to say, which, is asking the question of, is the reason that, for example, we're having to build all these houses because we've got a city the size of Birmingham coming into the country every 2 years, in addition to, forget, the birth rate or anything, that's just net migration into the country. That is an awful lot of houses that you're going to need to build to house all of those people. Never mind the people who are on waiting lists for council houses or people who are your grandchildren who can't afford a house. So you can understand why there are a lot of people who think that the question of housing, public services, doctors, dentists, all of those things are to do with immigration, and people are frightened to talk about that because they think it's racist.
But wouldn't the Conservatives do well, particularly with the younger generation? I mean, the idea of being a young Tory these days seems to be an oxymoron. Wouldn't that be an idea if they actually just become more YIMBY than NIMBY and commit themselves to building more? Because it's interesting to see Labour have used the same target as the Conservatives, 300,000 a year. It's not particularly ambitious. It certainly doesn't catch up with immigration, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
Farage was going on about building a house every 2 minutes, round the clock to replace, to house people who are just coming here.
Yeah.
Is that a policy that whoever is the next Tory leader should adopt?
Well, I think it's interesting that if you look at the demographics, a lot of young people voted for reform. And I think probably part of the reason for that is that they are linking not being able to buy a house with immigration. And you can argue about whether that's right or wrong. But I think the Tories probably haven't been doing that. And that's, I think, part of the reason that the Tories have not been attracting younger people, which they clearly need to do. Now, they don't need to necessarily become, reform or reform light, but they do probably need to start talking about realistic migration caps. And these aren't Farage. This isn't sort of Farageism. This is Cameronism.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about the massive lurch to the right. We're talking about going back to Cameron.
But they've never achieved it. I think to back to Paul's point.
But they've abandoned it altogether.
But business needs talent. The talent isn't in the country, as you say, Camilla. We are facing actually probably a fertility crisis, and there will be a population decline will be an issue for us over the next decade and over the decade. So the demand is there. The reason that the government has never been successful in reducing immigration to the country, and that's very different, of course, from illegal immigration and asylum seekers. That's a completely different issue. Mm-hmm. But the reason that immigration has been so high is because businesses, the economy, needs the workforce and wants to go where it believes it can best get the workforce from. And obviously, in most years, not every year, they are net tax payers, not benefit takers, usually. Yeah. So, okay, these are sort of big answers. I think there's another issue, though, for the Conservatives, which is how do they consider the Liberal Democrats? I know there's a lot of debate about reform, but because of the way the Liberal Democrats can operate in first past the post, they're very, very skilled on-the-ground campaigners, and they have very concentrated votes in the right places, which they have built over many, many years through their local networks. How do the Conservatives respond to the Liberal Democrat wave, who won many, many more MPs, obviously, than Reform? And I think that doesn't come from a discussion about their right flank, but it does come from a discussion about that kind of centrist, maybe more what are we doing about the NHS, social care, looking after people, rivers and sewage, etc.
Right, let's open it to the floor.
Yes.
Who would like to ask the first question, please? Hello, sir. Thank you. We'll get a microphone to this chap here, who's on the second row in the spectacles, third from the right. There we are.
Second row.
Yeah. Second row, sorry. Hello, chap. Do you mind saying your first name and where you're from?
I'm John, and I'm from North Oxfordshire.
Nice to see you, John. Thank you.
One thing you haven't touched on in terms of the challenges for growth, which the Labour Party is going to have to address, is the fact we've got, I think it's 9.4 million people of working age who are neither in employment or seeking employment.
Yes.
And unless they can tackle that, not much else will help.
All right, let's put that to Paul, because, Paul, you've addressed that issue of
there are a lot of people who don't work, and a lot of them are unwell and unable to work, and a lot of that is mental health, which has apparently been caused or made worse by the conditions of COVID and lockdown and all those kind of things. So there are a lot of people who are of the age to work, but say they can't or won't or don't work. How you persuade them to work is something actually that, as far as I can see, Labour is trying to work on. Whether it will achieve it, I don't know. But you can't really force someone to go to work except by saying, well, we're not going to give you any money, which was a plan of the previous government, that they were going to stop benefits after a year if you were deemed to be someone who could work but is choosing not to. I don't imagine Labour will do that. But they certainly are going to encourage and help people to work. That's what they say. Whether that will succeed, we'll have to wait and see. But you can see a number grow, and you can say that's a big number and that worries us. But it doesn't necessarily cause the problem that we have. And those people may not have the skills. They may not be willing to do the work. They may be unable to do the work. And I think you've got to look at all the causes of it and try and resolve those, and not just say, they're idlers, I'm going to cut off their benefits. One
of Reform's solutions to that problem was to raise the basic rate at which you pay tax
to £20,000.
I mean,
right.
How radical would that be? How costly would that be? Or is that actually
it would be
quite a good idea?
It would be very costly, but if you're a person in Reform, you would say, well, it wouldn't be costly because that would increase employment, increase tax, and increase productivity. But it would be extremely costly. I'm sorry, I don't have the figure, but raising the allowance by £1,000, which cost probably a couple of billion pounds, I think, a year. That was one of their plans to do that, yes, but they didn't cost any of this, so we don't know what it would have costed because, these were just sort of ideas, we're not going to come to power anyway. But I don't think that would solve this problem. The problem of people not working is not because they don't want the money, they don't want to be better off. It's because they have all sorts of other conditions, physical, mental, or skills, or whatever, that mean they just do not enter the labour force. And I think it's a problem, and it's an interesting problem, but I don't know the solution. The solution is to find the causes and try and solve the causes.
Those figures also, John, I think include early retirees, so people who could still work and don't. Let's have one more question from the floor and then we'll go digital. Graham, who I happen to know, which is why I'm calling him Graham, because that is his name.
Hi, Graham from Bushey in Hertfordshire. With the likes of Labour Together and others putting large amounts of money into Labour and lots of Blairites coming in ministerial positions, who's really putting the levers behind the scenes?
Kamal, you're very close to the Blairites. Pray tell.
Look, I think people forget that Tony Blair is the most successful leader Labour have ever had. And for a long period of his government, he had incredibly positive voter attitude towards him. I think people tend to forget and slightly over-index what happened towards the end, and obviously the Iraq War, but people forget that he won an election after the Iraq War, despite that being incredibly controversial. And I think that as you come into government with little experience, you need to lean on people who have some experience, because running and government is very difficult. And Blair was clearly, to an extent, whether you supported him or didn't support him, if you look at things like education, NHS outcomes, waiting lists, attitude to public services, their real decline came with austerity and after 2010, not between 1997 and 2010. So Blair is a useful partner to the new government. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think a lot is made in the media of who's pulling the strings, but I think with Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner, Keir Starmer, you've got a set of people there who are pretty tough thinkers themselves, but they are leaning on the evidence of the past. And I think, as someone, in previous roles has sometimes been involved in sort of policy creation, you do need that, because people who come into government seem to think that you pull a lever over here and you'll definitely get the outcome you imagine. And what did Tony Blair make very clear in his second term of government? That's what I thought when I came in. I thought I'd put all these policies in place, but nothing actually happened. And having that expertise is probably quite useful.
I just want to balance this conversation by saying I did look at the historical political approval ratings of previous Conservative and Labour politicians, and Tony Blair remains the least popular Labour politician in history with the British public.
After he stopped being Prime Minister.
Indeed
Whilst
so.
being Prime Minister, he was very popular.
Gordon, just this question online relates into this. It's a question about who's really running the show. The question is, how long is Keir Starmer likely to be Labour's leader before his real left wing try to oust him? But perhaps a more sort of nuanced question would be, is this a reverse? We discussed this on the Daily Tea, didn't we? Is this a reverse of Blair and Brown, and actually Reeves is in charge?
I don't know that that's the case. I think that there are people waiting in the wings, definitely. I think you have to remember that Starmer was never meant to be Prime Minister, as far as Labour were concerned. He was the guy that was going to get them to within touching distance of winning, because they all thought Boris was going to be in for 10 years, and then Boris blew up. Starmer proved to be a lot more competent than they thought he was going to be. He was very good at reforming the party. He was ruthless in getting rid of the anti-Semites and momentum. I think a lot of people underestimated him in that sense. So he was meant to be the guy that was warming the seat up for Wes Streeting. So Wes Streeting is still going to be thinking that his chance is going to come. Yeah. I think he is possibly more the Gordon Brown figure in all of this. And clearly there will be people who are waiting for Starmer to drop the ball in the hope that they will then, be able to do that. Well, it's not going to be a Brown transition. It could be a lot more bloody than that.
I'm sort of tempted to say who runs the show the bankers and the international money markets, which is the normal answer people give. Because, and don't forget, Rachel Reeves was a Bank of England economist for 6 years. You know, she's not just any old chancellor. She's got that background in very traditional banking thought, and that will be very good for Labour, because that will help them do well with the markets and do well with the banking.
And it's interesting, that does build on the reform issue, because the markets are signalling they prefer sort of centrist policies. You know, the interest on our debt has actually gone down since Labour won, because the money markets are saying competency, stability, 5 years without chaos. We quite like that.
And also inflation is falling, and that brings the debt, servicing the debt costs down, because most of the debt, the UK's debt, is index linked. So as inflation falls, it becomes cheaper.
We'll go back to the floor, because I saw a couple of young people put their hands up.
Right.
Yes, the chap there, just on the end of that row. Thank you so much. We'll just get a microphone to you now. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Johnny from North London. Labour made a lot of noise about votes at 16 during the election. If they were to implement it, could it spectacularly backfire for them?
In answer to the initial part of that question, it was not in the King's speech, which is interesting. It was conspicuous by its absence. Are you asking that, Johnny, because you've seen that Reform and Nigel Farage is getting a lot of pickup on social media, and we've also witnessed in the European parliamentary elections some right-wing parties gain more younger support?
That as well, but also in terms of 16 to 17-year-olds, particularly 16, 17-year-old girls, particularly the Green Party as well.
Yes.
So
Gordon?
not just Reform, but also the Green Party too.
Well, one would assume that is what they are thinking. Otherwise, why is it not in the King's speech? It seemed like a very obvious thing for them to do. It's pretty simple and straightforward.
Doesn't cost anything.
Doesn't cost anything. They would get it through, and the assumption has always been that if they lowered the voting age to 16, then they've got a baked-in advantage because young people vote Labour, and that's it. So the fact that they haven't done it, I think it's a very good question, and you may well be right. You're probably a lot closer to what people your age think than I am, clearly. And maybe their sort of internal polling is making them have pause for thought that maybe it's not going to be the net gain that they thought it was. I don't know the answer, but it's a good question.
Related to that, Melissa has asked about Labour's position on university fees and the weight of student loans on young people. And I will say to Melissa that Labour have said absolutely nothing about tuition fees, scrapping them. Even the Liberal Democrats wouldn't return to that festering pile of proverbial, because it cost them so very dearly after the coalition years. So they've not said really anything on that at all. Another question for the room, please. Yes, at the back. There's a chap there on the end.
Hi, my name is Adam and I'm from Cheshire. For some reason, policing and ensuring law and order has been at the back of everyone's mind. And I was wondering, how do you believe Labour will actually deal with justice and ensuring crime is handled when our prisons are full and our morals are practically down the drain?
Oh, well, in the King's speech, they said on policing and crime that they wanted to sort of scrap
Give police
that
more
thing.
powers for antisocial behaviour.
And also to say that thing about you can nick items up to 200 quid and not really be bothered by officers should go, even though it is illegal still, by the way, to steal any items at all. It was just that was the threshold that seemed to be set by the Met. We've also heard from Metropolitan Police Commissioner Mark Rowley today saying, that the service has shrunk, and harking back to Theresa May and saying the numbers are being cut too drastically, which I think most people on this panel can agree was a catastrophic mistake by the former Home Secretary and Prime Minister.
There is quite a lot of window dressing here, to your point. The other thing to add to that was that it is now going to be a specific offence for assaulting a shop worker, although, of course, assaulting anyone is a specific offence. So there's a bit of window dressing here. Their key, as you say, their key problem at this stage is the prisons. The prisons is an absolutely shambolic situation, which has been building back to the Blair years, actually, and through the 2010s and the Conservative administrations about how we deal with our prison population. Crime has always been a difficult area for the left, because this idea of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, Labour are much more comfortable on what might be described as the causes of crime, not saying anything about, behaviour, but, maybe inequality, the fact that if people don't have or can't see a way forward legally, they may go illegally. Labour is always much more comfortable in that area than it is tough on the crime itself.
I think Starmer, though, is very tough on crime, and he was when he was the DPP, very tough on crime. He was quite ruthless. As you said, he's quite a ruthless man. Gordon said he's quite a ruthless man. I'm not sure if I agree with you that morals have gone down the drain, but I do think that the prisons are the real problem. And I was actually very encouraged that James Timpson, Lord Timpson now, was appointed as prisons minister, because he has been a prison reform campaigner for years and employed hundreds, if not thousands, of ex-prisoners in his shops. Because the key thing about prisons is once people are let out, they don't go back because they don't carry on committing crimes. And that is the key to prison reform and to bringing the numbers down. In the short term, they've had to bring them down by letting people go 40% of their sentences. But I think prison reform is the most important way to make sure there are sufficient prison spaces for people who should be in jail. And I think that's what Labour's planning to do. Whether it will work is a different matter. But I think Timpson is a very, very interesting appointment.
One thing we haven't discussed, and Anne touches on it in her question here, about sort of the rise of sectarian politics and the idea of educational institutions exerting or condoning pressure to conform with religious ideology, such as schools targeted like Michaela in Wembley. How do you think Labour's going to cope with that? And this whole, these 4 independents now that have been elected basically on this pro-Palestinian stump, and whether they can cause problems for Labour.
Five independents.
Whether they can cause problems for Labour when it comes to where Starmer positions himself on the conflict in the Middle East.
I saw something earlier. There is, I think those 5 have got together with 17 Labour MPs to try and start putting pressure on Starmer over Palestine, which I think is interesting. I think that when one of the earlier questions about how long before the left takes over, one of the things we don't really know about the Labour Party is how left-wing their new MPs are, because there are so many of them, and Starmer probably hasn't even met most of them before. So I think it's going to be a while before that sort of shakes down and before we really start understanding what the current crop of Labour MPs stand for. So I think, if you've already got people who've just been elected, when you would have thought they'd probably be on their best behaviour, starting to, amalgamate themselves with these pro-Palestinian MPs, that's not a great sign for Labour.
No. Let's try. Time is fast running out. We've got 3 minutes left.
From Bath, furthest travel.
Cheshire's further than Bath.
Cheshire and Bath.
Cheshire,
Bath.
goodness. Bath.
We need your mic. We need you to mic up and your name. We know your location.
I'm Claire from Bath. So I just wanted to know why you think Rishi chose to have the election in July and didn't wait until January?
Because he knew that Reform didn't have their sort of campaign together, that they weren't a professionalised outfit. Farage had already suggested in various interviews to various people, including to me, that he was going to go off to America and campaign for Trump, and therefore they didn't think he would be a danger. I think also there was a degree of impatience that he had to have enough of people going, when are you going to call an election? When are you going to call an election? And indeed, wanted to move the conversation on. And there had been a flirtation with even having that election in May. And once that was being taken seriously by people inside Downing Street, it then seemed to follow that he did what he did in July, obviously not predicting that Farage would call his bluff. And then, of course, the D-Day debacle changing everything in that second week. So, it now looks like a catastrophic error, not least because we're seeing the green shoots of economic recovery sprouting up as the sun has finally decided to shine on us this week. And, he could have enjoyed more of that. The other reason was he didn't want more boat crossings over summer. But as we've seen, funnily enough, a Labour government doesn't mean that we magically wake up and the boats have stopped coming and child poverty has been wiped out overnight and there's no homelessness on the streets of London. These things take time to repair. Another couple of questions in the room, because I saw a few hands. Young man at the back, and then we'll go to you and then we'll have to close. Yes.
Hi, I'm Will from Lancashire, and I'm wondering that given for every party to win, it basically has to form some type of coalition. Where did the Conservative Party go? The demographics, the home counties have changed a lot, and that's meant they've lost, I can't remember if they call them the Surrey Shufflers, that all switched to Lib Dems. If they can't win the home counties and they can't win the Boris Johnson Red Wall and they can't win the North East because Reform, is taking like Greater Yarmouth and Boston and Skegness, where do they go? I don't see a path forward for a party that's been beaten on its left flank and beaten on its right flank.
I'm just going to give that to Gordon because he has been with one of the leadership candidates today. Am I allowed to say?
Well, I just spent some time with Robert Jenrick today. I think it's a really interesting question. I think there is a definite danger that we're going to see this play out in the leadership contest, right? So they are going to have to answer that question. There is a huge problem for them that you're going to have a lot of Tory MPs saying we have to go to the right because we have to see off the threat of reform. We have to attract those people that went to reform. And you're going to have the One Nation people saying you only ever win elections from the centre. That's where we've gone wrong. And both of those points are pretty valid. And you can make very strong arguments for each. And how you somehow marry those two together is going to be the question that the person that becomes the next leader is going to have to answer. I think that the answer for the Tories is they are going to have to start talking about things that are difficult to talk about. And I think that's part of the reason they did so badly in the election. They didn't want to talk about tax, really. They didn't want to talk about immigration. Rishi Sunak didn't want to talk about leaving the ACHR. These are all things which I think they could have mitigated quite a lot, and they may not have lost so badly. And quite honestly, if he'd waited, and if he had got Rwanda flights off, this is the thing I can't really understand. If he really thought Rwanda flights were going to take off, wait until that happens. He would have kept a lot more people on board, I think, not the people who are on the planes.
Paul, we're running out of sorry. Yeah. One more question from the young man there, and then we're done.
Hi, I'm Nathan, and I'm from Brentwood, Essex. My question is that, given that the two main parties' vote shares dropped to the lowest it's ever been, is there now a credible case for proportional representation?
PR. You're speaking Faragian language there. Should we have PR, Paul? We had a referendum on it in 2011 and we rejected it.
I mean, the present system seems daft, and I agree, because, Labour's got 174 majority with a lower share of the vote than they got under Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. So it seems daft. And, the Lib Dems have got 72 MPs, and Reform with more votes, have got 7 MPs. It seems daft. But it is such a completely different system, and it would require a complete change in the way politics is conducted in Britain. I'm neither for nor against it. I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime.
Interestingly, the Labour members did vote for it their.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Not anymore, they're not.
No. Well, exactly.
Funny enough, the Liberal Democrats appear to have fallen out of love with the idea of PR.
Yes, I remember speaking to a very, very senior Labour person just ahead of the election, and he said, if you think after winning this landslide under first past the post, we're then going to rip up the electoral system, you are crazy. So I don't think there's any hope. I think as well, we have many, many advantages from the constituency first past the post system, which actually does lead to a degree of stability that we see that in Europe you have not had. And I think that if you're looking at trying to change policies and make the big transformations that we need in this country, having a big, solid majority is at least a starting point to have a go at the changes we need to achieve.
Well, that's us done. We've done an hour very, very quickly. At least it feels as if it is zoomed by. Thank you very much to Paul Lewis, to Gordon Rayner. Can we stress that the Daily Tea podcast is broadcast every day at 5 p.m. You can get it on all of the typical podcast platforms. You can also get it as subscribers on the Telegraph website. It's very easy to find. Click and listen. We shall be back on the podcast tomorrow, Friday at 5 p.m. But for now, Kamal and Camilla wish you in the room and you watching online a very, very lovely evening, and thanks for taking part.
Good night.